Hello everyone, it's your local contrarian raccoon here again today to complain about the N64 once more. I kid you, I'm not going to be nearly as biased in this video as my other reviews, since I want to take a look at various objective qualities of two beloved 90s consoles, the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. These two titans of late 90s, early 2000s gaming are both legendary and hold a great amount of nostalgia with many gamers. Given they both have a strong footing in retro gaming, you'd probably assume both had an almost equal footing back in their prime. Well, you'd be wrong. Yeah, the PS1 sold nearly 70 million more units than the N64, which goes a long way in explaining why N64 games are almost always more expensive than those for the PlayStation. But remember kids, being more popular doesn't always make that thing better. If that was really the case, then Cardi B is better than King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. In many cases, which console is better will come down to personal preferences, since both have different lineups of games. For this comparison, I'll be putting both consoles head to toe in various categories and scoring a point for which console is better at said aspect. Some of these will be a bit more objective, while others will come down to my personal tastes. So without any further ado, let's delve into technical specs. The PS1 and N64, unlike modern consoles, were very different beasts indeed. They both had very different hardware specs, and much of that is due to the different formats the games ran on. PS1 games used discs, whereas N64 games used cartridges. Nintendo opting to stick with cartridges when the game industry was moving toward a CD format had a profound effect on what was capable on the console. This meant that while the N64 technically had smoother graphics and short load times, the games couldn't hold quite as much storage as the PS1. In other words, that led to games being more compact and less boundary pushing than those that we saw in the PS1. The PlayStation had the malady of occasionally long load times, but could hold far more data. This led to games utilizing full voice acting and CD quality soundtracks. The PS1 was 32-bit, whereas the N64 was, you guessed it, 64-bit. But aside from some slight graphical advantages over the PS1, the N64 was by and large weaker than the PS1 on the technical front. The cartridge format was simply outdated even for the time, and really hurt the system in the long run. So I'm giving a point to the PlayStation. Graphics aren't the end-all be-all of games. I can name tons of horrible games that are technically speaking good-looking, and the N64 and PS1 were the first mainstream consoles to be almost completely 3D focused. As such, I'm going to judge these games not by how they look now, but by how they looked back then. To be honest, it depends from game to game. While the N64 typically looked more blurry and the PS1 looked more pixelated, both have games that push their consoles' respective boundaries in mind-blowing ways. I'll say one thing though, at least the N64 doesn't have texture warp, although this isn't a problem if you're using emulation. Thanks to emulator technology, it's hard to say which console is generally better in terms of visuals these days. If I really had to say with a gun pointed to my head, I would say the PS1 because that system's large storage capacity led to more impressive graphical techniques overall in spite of more pixelated visuals. But both systems have some very aesthetically pleasing games. Ridge Racer 64 looks great, as does Gran Turismo. Banjo-Kazooie looks amazing, as does Spyro. The systems do have slightly different aesthetics in terms of visuals, but which one you prefer generally comes down to preference. Honestly, I'm going to say that it's a tie, so both consoles get a point in this category. With its CD technology, the PS1 was a real step forward in terms of video game music. We now started getting soundtracks that utilize live instrumentation rather than MIDIs, and even some licensed stuff too. The N64, on the other hand, couldn't really pull that off very well. Most games stuck to using MIDI scores, which, while legendary, don't have the same kind of clarity you'd hear on a PS1. As such, many N64 scores only sounded like a marginal step up from those heard on the Super Nintendo. Sure, you did get some amazing stuff such as Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and my favorite, F-Zero X, but the PlayStation CD technology led to a higher quantity of great soundtracks with only marginal compression, not to mention the ability to have licensed soundtracks without cutting the songs in half. See the Tony Hawk games for that. Orchestral scores aren't my thing, but the PS1 allowed for that to be pushed to its full potential too, with the Medal of Honor games. Voice acting also suffered on the N64. Many games had little to no voice acting at all, and whenever voice acting did appear in full, it was very compressed. Conker's Bad Fur Day is a real outlier in the N64 catalog due to its use of full voice acting. The PS1 allowed full voice acting thanks to the CD technology, and many games right off the bat utilized this technology. Sure, many early games had Tommy Wiseau level voice acting.
You must recover all the energy immediately, Mega Man.
But where is Dr. Wily?
That's a good question. We may be able to locate another energy emission from the radar room. When we find that meteor, we'll find Dr. Wily.
But the technology eventually helped pave the way to where games are today. The N64 instead just languished in outdated technology, and other than having a few legendary soundtracks, was vastly inferior to the PS1 in terms of sound quality. I'm giving a point to the PlayStation. The N64 controller is bad. Okay, there's more to the story than that. The original PS1 controller lacked the now famous analog sticks, being more in line with the Super Nintendo controller, while the N64 controller from day one had an analog stick. The problem lies in one simple design choice: the third handle. Yeah, to whoever greenlit this design, I'd like to inform you that humans by and large only have two arms. Sure, some people out there might have a third arm protruding from their chest due to exposure to nuclear waste, but 99% of us have two arms. Eventually, the PS1 controller would gain two analog sticks, something that set the permanent blueprint for modern gaming controllers. The N64 controller does indeed function, and you'll eventually get the hang of it, but I've never understood the odd design choice from the day I first saw it. The one advantage that the N64 did have, though, was 4 controller ports by default, which made it better for multiplayer gaming. If you were a PS1 gamer, you would have to buy an add-on for that, and not all games utilize it. Still, the PS1 wins this battle pretty easily. Can I be real here? The PS1 isn't the best looking console out there. It's far from the ugliest console I've seen, leave that to the Jaguar CD. I want to take a piss on this thing. But the PS1 just looks mediocre, very gray and very 90s, and not the totally rad type of 90s, I'm talking about the boring and pedestrian kind of 90s. The N64, on the other hand, is a sleek black beauty that I find more aesthetically pleasing than the PS1, and a major step up from the somewhat homely Super Nintendo. This is definitely one of Nintendo's best looking consoles. The same can't be said of the PS1. Its look does hold heavy nostalgia, don't get me wrong, but almost every PlayStation console afterwards would usurp it in terms of console design. I'm giving a point to the Nintendo 64. The libraries of the PS1 and N64 were pretty different. The PS1 featured more mature-themed games from the very start, but eventually became a healthy balance of family-friendly platformers and the more mature stuff. The N64, being a Nintendo console, featured largely E-rated games. Again, I'm going to have to say that this comes down to preference. If you're a real tough badass who wants a bunch of blood, shit, and fuck in your games, then the PS1's got something in store for you. If you're a good, honest Christian mother who doesn't want your kids to be exposed to satanic imagery such as blood and naughty words, then the N64 is the holiest console on the market. Sure, there were some games with mild blood, and Conker's Bad Fur Day would come along to take the title of literal shittiest game of all time. Seriously, the Great Mighty Pooh Boss actually made me feel sick. But by and large, it was largely family-friendly stuff. The N64 had fewer games than the PS1, which is both a good and bad thing. Bad thing because you're sooner to run out of games to play, but also a good thing because it means there were far fewer shovelware games than the PS1 had, something that console was plagued by during its dying years. Because taste in games is a subjective thing, points will be given to both consoles in this category. And with that, the PS1 is crowned winner. I threw away as much nostalgic bias as I possibly could prior to making this review. I grew up with the PS1, so it's going to be the console I prefer regardless. But even then, I can't deny that the PS1 was just objectively better in many aspects. In terms of hardware specs, it most certainly was. Hence why games on that system were far more likely to push boundaries with things such as voice acting and soundtracks. We had bigger and better stories, and it can't be denied that the PS1 helped make gaming what it is today. The N64 has some stellar games on it, and when it comes to multiplayer, it's the obvious choice. But for most gamers in the late 90s, the PS1 was an easier sell. If you wanted the most technologically advanced system with the most games, you'd get the PlayStation, and it's easy to see why the N64 kinda flopped, comparatively speaking. By 1996, cartridges were becoming a thing of the past for home consoles at least, and the PlayStation's embracement of new, advanced technology gave it many advantages over the N64. I'll still concur that the N64 is a fantastic console with some outstanding games on it, but it's very hard to argue that it had many advantages over its rival. The technology it used simply held it back, and that's honestly kinda sad. If Nintendo had been more open-minded and adapted to the CD format, I think the N64 would have stood a better chance in the console wars. Sure, 32 million units is nothing to scoff at, but like stated earlier, that is nothing in comparison to 100 million units sold. Which console you prefer, however, is up to you, and I completely understand and respect those who prefer the N64. While the PS1 is my preferred pick, I've really enjoyed my time diving into the N64's catalog, and I can say that it was still a console worth owning back in the day. I mean, we can argue about which is better all day, but I think we can all agree in unison that both were far better than the Sega Saturn.